So for my part, I'm gonna try to just share a little bit of some of my personal kind of learned moments. I want to say that my academic background is in communication. So through my work in kind of the community, I started to volunteer a little bit more of my time through working with the youth. And to my very happy surprise, I was able to find some high school students who were actually very interested in, helping study and preserve Chinese American and Asian American history. Earlier, I showed you part of some of the initiatives that they did, and they decided to use a quiz to test people about what they know about local history. And we're looking at about 700 to 800 people who have actually taken the quiz. Another thing that they're doing is they're wanting to visit Valhalla. It was one particular individual who was buried there that caught their interest. It was a 6-year-old girl, and her grave marker happens to be on the far end of one of the original plots that the Chinese deceased were allowed to be buried. So for many who think, oh, good job, Valhalla, letting them, making this agreement. But if you go visit, if you look at the original plots, they didn't quite get the best property or real estate. So one of the original plots is actually very much on the far end, and it was near a creek. So some of the earlier markers actually are in real danger of falling apart. And one of those ones belonged to a 6-year-old girl. And the youth, we've been there several times. Every time we go visit that particular grave marker, and they really wanted to actually do something to actually preserve it. Several of them, would bring a little flower to them. So, involving the student, involving the youth definitely matters. But here are some interesting things that I personally learned. So I hesitate to call this research per se, because I'm aware that I'm not really. How to do this? Okay.
It might have fallen asleep.
Oh, it did. Okay, there you go. Okay. So I wanted to ask if you had to guess, when do you think was about what time did St. Louis actually have our own Chinese language newspaper? We know that now we've had newspapers that have weekly publications for many years, and they are, instrumental into the community, in St. Louis, but also in Missouri. But where would you put that year? In fact, this was actually linked to one of the most-known early Chinese advocates in America. His name is Wang Qingfu. Later on, I'm going to share with you another individual, and his name is also Wang, but I wanted to clarify that this Wang is Sanheng Yishu Wang, and the next Wang is actually Huang. But because the Americans, we decided to write them out the same way. Wang Qingfu is probably one of the most influential early Chinese American advocate or Chinese advocate in America. He was credited with coining the term Chinese American, and he was a journalist, and he decided to use the term Chinese American in naming one of his early newspapers. He was a prolific writer. He was educated in America, and he was, for instance, he was the person who published Manhattan's first Chinese newspaper. This was back in 1883. So just give you a clue, not too long after that, he came to start a newspaper in St. Louis. So for instance, in 1896, he started the semi-monthly Chinese news in Chicago. And these were written in Chinese for the Chinese community members. Okay, so you can actually, this is a really nice book written about him. The first Chinese American, The Remarkable Life of Wang Qingfu, it was actually also translated into Chinese as well. So as you can see, he was also an activist. I decided to pull this article because this was one of the notable things that he engaged in. He decided to take on Dennis Kearney, who was the American politician who was very much vocal and behind the Chinese Exclusion Act. If you've heard this logo by, say, Chinese must go, oftentimes he was very much involved in it. So what he did in this case is that he actually decided to take on this person in a almost face-to-face, like, let's go. We can take this out in a physical fight, or we can have a debate about it. So you can see that he, in fact, was trying to actually approach him and try to contact him. And And he wrote a letter. This letter was delivered to this Dennis Kearney, and he was basically saying in this letter that I told him while he was asking to be considered a member of this nation, was complaining of the tyranny of England, the empire to which I belong to, he was talking about himself, was the oldest on the globe. But besides that, I suggested to him, to Dennis, that in national dignity, I could look down upon him. So you can see that he was talking with great pride of the country that he came from. And he was speaking up about the Chinese individuals living. The flag of China waves over the third greatest navy of the world. Our ambassadors rank in England, ranking Europe with those of Russia, Germany, England, and France. I would say that my countrymen were entitled to the same advantages as his. And I challenged him to dispute these statements. So he was talking about how, he sent this letter and really wanting to have a one-on-one conversation about why would you actually be, challenge him to have a discussion about this anti-Asian sentiment and dialogue. And another interesting anecdote was that he was really trying to specifically take on this, rumors portraying, like Peter said earlier, how Chinese in America were rat eaters, right? Remember, you mentioned that. So he, in fact, actually openly said anyone who can actually produce real evidence of Chinese Americans in America eating rats, I'll give him $500. And the thing is, nobody was actually able to claim that $500. So he was in St. Louis, not for a very, very long time, but he was in St. Louis. We have this record of him giving a speech about China right here in St. Louis in 1878. He would also later travel to St. Louis oftentimes to help translate for court cases. You can see a lot of those early advocates and community organizers, they had to wear multiple hats. So, in addition to being a journalist, being an activist, he was also a translator. So this was the discussion about the news storyline about how he was talking about China and the Chinese to a small audience. We know that he started a Chinese weekly news in St. Louis in about May 1896. So you can see that in this particular article, this was published 2 months after. So in July 1896, it was talking about the newspaper was actually published in Cantonese dialect. And it was on 800 Pine Street, and the news article, his publication was having some coverage about a particular resident of Hob Alley resident's death. And here, it was around the same time, it was referring to him as the journalist of Hob Alley, and he was talking about how he wanted to start a political party, which, by the way, he actually did start later. We don't think he started it in St. Louis, but we first learned about it in St. Louis. It was talking about they were referring to him as Colonel Wang Qingfu, the editor of Chinese Weekly News of St. Louis, and he was being backed by one of the major merchants of Hob Alley, who had a Chinese art store on 8th Street. And he was talking about how he was not satisfied with the neglect of both parties, with regard to the Chinese American community's needs. And he said, I approached both of them. I went to their assembly. I did not receive any positive feedback. I'm going to start a party. So we did I remember reading somewhere that he, in fact, did found the American Liberty Party. We don't know much about what happened to that party, but there was mention to that. Another kind of interesting ambitions and kind of accomplishments, for instance, he founded the Chinese Equal Rights League in 1892. This was a few years after his activities here in St. Louis. We can see that he was kind of moving more from journalism to activism, and he testified before Congress against the Chinese Exclusion Act. He organized rallies in New York City, in Boston, again, all to protest the exclusionary policies. This is, unfortunately, this is not the newspaper from St. Louis. I wish we could find a physical copy or any other record of the actual paper that he published in St. Louis. This was actually another newspaper that he was published, and it was the actual first issue of the Chinese American, which he did publish, he did organize, remember that. This was why we say that he was the person credited for coining the term Chinese American. Another thing I wanted to say is the other Wang. His name is actually Huang. And if you had to, oftentimes we know about how St. Louis had the honor of, hosting the World's Fair in 1904, and there was a major Chinese delegation, right? If you remember, it was a huge deal to the Emperor Dowager, and she actually sent a representative of royal blood, right? So we know that Prince Pulun, the brother of the emperor, actually was here in St. Louis as the main commissioner of the Chinese delegation. The Chinese exhibit is supposed to actually be a replica of his residence in China, right? Or was at least designed after his residence in China. But obviously, I'm not trying to say that he is the one who led the delegation. Well, in name, for sure he was, but I'm arguing that his second-hand man was actually more influential and had a much stronger and longer presence in St. Louis. And as you can see, this is one of the photos that shows Mr. Wang Kai Ka. So his Chinese name would be Huang Kai Jia. Huang, not Wang. As you can see that here we have him over here wearing his royal robe attire. And he was actually, I believe, on the platform on top of where the Imperial Pavilion would later be built. He was actually meeting with the president of the exposition, Mr. Francis, surrounded by this crowd. So the idea is that the prince would only be in America in St. Louis for a shorter amount of time, but Mr. Wang was here for an extensive amount of time. In fact, he had to get a residence. In fact, St. Louis City had to actually pave a road, Longfellow Road, just so that transportation needs of his team could be met. So there were some stories about how that showed St. Louis's hospitality to his team. So I wanted to share, here is a picture showing the Vice Commissioner, Mr. Wang, that's him on the left, and it was right outside of his house in Goodfellow Avenue, meeting a fellow Chinese resident of St. Louis. So he had a house, his family was here, his wife was here, his daughters were here, they attended events, they socialized. Every time they did something, oftentimes there's media coverage. So I would argue that during that period of time, it's a short amount of time that he was here, he kind of acted as kind of a spokesperson, maybe not spokesperson, but his movements, his speeches, he was an eloquent speaker, really helped portray positive images. So a little bit about Mr. Wang. He was among the 120 young boys that the Qing dynasty actually sent to study in the US in the late 1870s. So Mr. Wang was actually among the first group, and he came as a 12-year-old, and he studied in Connecticut. And he didn't quite finish Yale, but he was educated in Yale. The reason that he didn't finish, as many of the students didn't finish, actually get their degrees, was because the government, I think it's a pretty ridiculous move, decided to recall all of them, regardless, though they had to go return back to China. But actually, later, of course, he was recognized by Yale University for many years. He served as the leader or the president of the Yale Chinese Student Alumni Association. So he would return to the U.S. in 1903 to prepare for the World's Fair, and he was the vice commissioner. As you can see, he was very much playing the role of the educator. He was educating the city about Chinese culture in the delegation. Here's an article that was published in 1901, interviewing him. It was funny because he was taking the time out to actually explain Chinese joke. For those who actually do understand Chinese, you'll notice that unfortunately, our journalist wasn't quite educated enough because they actually printed it upside down. So you actually need to read like this. It was really interesting. This one was printed okay, but this one was printed upside down. So it's kind of, it was kind of sad. But if you read the story, I remember reading the story, and that was kind of funny. They were saying that he was very much a dry sense of humor, and they were making connections to Mark Twain, and he was commenting on Mark Twain and how Mark Twain was actually his favorite. So it was really interesting. You should read. These are the two jokes. The jokes were translated here, so it was really funny. And he actually exchanged ideas. For instance, he had a fascination about the way that the police was run. So he actually visited, he sent some of his team to actually visit and engage often with the local police. And there was an article talking about how he actually made a point of designating one of his team members to actually be educated about the police and how it's run, so that they can kind of quote unquote implement this back in China. They socialized. Here's a picture. This is an actual photo of his wife, I believe. As you can see that, they were making kind of big deal, describing in details about her gown and her silk and her hairdo and of course the way that she handled herself. And she was an advocate too. She was highly critical of the U.S. policy on Chinese immigrants. So you can see there are a couple of news articles here. I think he was invited to speak to the New England Association, and then he very strongly, in no ambiguous term, condemns the Chinese Exclusion Act as very unfair, and claiming with good foresight that I think America will need China in the future, and this kind of policy would not benefit either party. So you can see these are some articles, and he was a very eloquent author, writer, and speaker. So you can still read some of his speeches today. So here's one. I wanted to see if you can actually read it. So in this particular one, he was highly critical of how the U.S. Customs Office was actually making it really difficult, almost humiliatingly difficult, for the team, for the folks who would actually be coming to the U.S. for the exhibit for the World's Fair. He said, our government sent a cordial invitation to China. Well, this was written from the perspective of the journalist, and the Chinese government accepted with pleasure. Extensive Chinese exhibits were prepared. Then came the rulings of the Treasury Department that Chinese coming here to take part in the fair must be photographed, must comply with discriminating conditions not made applicable to any other nationals, and must give a bond that they would leave the country after the closing of the fair. So in this interview, Mr. Wang, as the vice commissioner, was speaking very, clearly how he felt about this policy. Does this appeal to the average businessman of treatment which should be accorded to fellow men whom Americans have invited to cooperate with them in making American undertaking a success? So you can see that he was being critical of that particular policy, making the argument that it's going to make it harder, for them to have a successful fair. Here's a picture of him with Prince Pulun. So, royal family member. And so that's, I believe, Prince Pulun. And here we have Mr. Wang Kai-ka. All right. I think for this part of the message, I'll just probably be super quick, because I think Peter mentioned some of these organizations. Organizations, play a huge role in any immigrant community. Usually first we figure out a way to survive. We figure out a way to make money and feed and put food on the table. And then eventually we start to realize that we need to come together and, organize and join our forces. And that's when studying these early organizations would be really interesting. So I'm just listing a few. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list. Liu He Hui, some of us have heard of this. The 6 companies had a huge presence all over America, and it was present here in St. Louis. The Onliang Merchant and Labor Association that we heard about earlier, that had a huge presence in St. Louis. In fact, one year the Onliang Merchant Association national organization had its annual conference right here in St. Louis. I wanted to also mention this Bao Huang Hui, which oftentimes is referred to the Emperor or Empire Reform Association. If you think that is meant to actually, restore the Qing dynasty's rule, not really. The key word here is actually on reform. So they're the organization who would, be behind, like things like, oh, let's remove our long queue, which is 剪头发. Right, so let's modernize. Let's practice more of an Americanized, modernized way. So here is actually a news article talking about the Bao Huang Hui. As you can see, they have their short hair, their Americanized attire, and this article is more about how they're thinking about. This actually did happen. They're actually mobilizing some sort of you know, not military, because obviously it's not the military, but they're training to actually hopefully go back, return to China and to join some sort of military movement to actually support the emperor, who at that time wanted to push for reform, right? So here is a news article talking about how right here in St. Louis, that organization was mobilizing the training and kind of militia training for Chinese youth here. I also wanted to just real quickly share some of the early findings that I've had about another organization that actually had a huge presence in the early Chinese community, which is the YMCA. In particular, in about 1878, this is probably when I don't know how big the population would be at that time, but at that time they actually started a Chinese Sunday school. Now it was very much about religion, but at least equally about learning the language and of course helping them adjust to society, which I really appreciate. As an international student, I received a lot of assistance from the local church group when I was an international student. I kind of see the parallel here. They started this Sunday Chinese school in 1878, and it would continuously be overseen by Miss Charles E. Ford, and this is supposed to be him or a portrait of him. And here's one of the articles that talk about the key individuals who actually invested in this. It was no small task. As you can see, here's an article about 25 years later. There was an article about how this obviously has become more successful. It shows pictures of some key individuals. I believe maybe this is right. Well, let me see. It's hard to see. This is Mrs. Jue Hong Yi, right? Jue Hong Yi, and for a long time she was known to be the only woman living in, and her husband was a major leader. And as you can see, both of them are very heavily involved in this initiative. So they would actually bring them together, and it was very much a individualized learning experience. As you can see, I wanted to pull up one article. I had one article here. As you can see, this was an article was published about 1881, which was about 3 years later. They already had about 24 students. And I love the fact that they listed every student, and they call them scholar. They call them the Chinese scholars. And every student actually had their own teacher. It was really, I think is fascinating. And it was in incredible amount of investment from the community. And they bring up some of the early photos here. As you can see, here is an actual photo of the students at that time attending the school. This was in 1903. So not only did this school continuously invest in teaching them the language, many of the students, for instance, later would become kind of quote unquote the leaders of the community, or what we call them the mayor of Haw Valley. And let me see. And then you can see that later on they would host events like Lunar New Year celebrations, and they would actually host events, other kind of cultural exchange events for the community as well. So that, I believe, was the end of my presentation that I prepared. I wanted to just share some things that I've personally learned about individuals that were noteworthy, and organizations that I feel played a role in that early years of the St. Louis Chinese history.